The chandeliers glittered above Manhattan's grandest ballroom as I stepped in, every eye turning toward me. Daniel Brooks, my arrogant ex-husband, raised his glass with a smirk and called me a failure while his mistress laughed at my expense. But I didn't flinch. I smiled calm and unshaken, because tonight wasn't about old wounds. Tonight I would let them laugh. Until the doors opened, and the man they never saw coming walked in. The city lights of Manhattan glimmered through the tall glass windows of the Grand Sterling Hotel, casting their reflection on the polished marble floor. I smoothed the silk of my midnight blue dress and forced myself to breathe evenly as I stepped into the ballroom. It was exactly as I imagined it would be. Chandeliers sparkled above, soft jazz floated through the air, and the hum of conversations was only broken by bursts of laughter from the wealthiest guests in the room. I told myself to stand tall. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my 35th birthday, not a reminder of every wound from my past. Yet the moment I saw him, everything tightened in my chest. Daniel Brooks. My ex-husband stood near the center of the room, perfectly tailored in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than a year of my old rent in Chicago. His arm was draped over Lila Moore, the woman who had shattered what was left of my marriage. Her red dress clung to her like she had dressed solely to be photographed, her sharp smile daring anyone to question her place beside him. I should have looked away, but my eyes locked on theirs. And then it happened. Daniel raised his glass, and his voice carried easily across the room, sharp enough to cut through the music and the chatter. "Hannah, you still look the same, still trying so hard to matter. But you are nothing but a failure." The room froze. I felt it. Conversations died, glasses stilled midway, faces turned toward me with a mixture of pity and hunger for drama. Lila tilted her head and laughed, a sound so sweet and poisonous that it burned. I didn't flinch. I lifted my chin, walked further inside, and let my heels click against the marble like I owned the ground I was walking on. I didn't rush. Every step was deliberate. I could see Daniel's smirk deepen, convinced he had the upper hand, convinced I would crumble the way I once did. I reached the bar, signaled the bartender with a small nod, and accepted a glass of champagne. My hands didn't shake. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. All eyes stayed on me as I turned slightly, holding my glass with calm precision, and sipped. The champagne was cold and dry, the kind that bit the back of my throat, but I welcomed it. It reminded me that I was not the same woman who once begged him to stay. I looked at him, then really looked, and for just a flicker of a second, I thought I saw surprise in his expression. Maybe it was because I didn't look away. Maybe because I smiled. A quiet, measured smile that held a promise he didn't understand yet. Lila leaned in close to him, whispering something, with her lips curled in amusement. He chuckled. I caught the sound even over the music. A few guests glanced between us, waiting for the spectacle to unfold, some of them already whispering, their eyes sharp with curiosity. George Miller. My father once told me that in moments like this, silence can cut sharper than words. He was right. I didn't shout. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. Instead, I stood there sipping my champagne, letting the tension stretch just long enough that Daniel began to shift uncomfortably, as if my composure was a language he no longer understood. Sophie and Lucas weren't here. Thank God. I had shielded my twins from this world, this pettiness. But tonight wasn't about old pain. Tonight was about something else entirely. Tonight, I would give Daniel the last thing he ever expected from me. Lila's laugh rang out again, softer this time, almost uncertain, like she couldn't quite figure out why I wasn't reacting. Daniel glanced toward the entrance of the room for a moment, as if to find a new audience, but every gaze was fixed on us. I saw him grip his glass a little tighter. I finished my drink slowly, set it down on the bar, and turned slightly so the chandeliers framed me rather than him. I let the silence hang just long enough to draw in every last ounce of their attention. They thought they knew me. They thought I was still the woman who walked out of that courthouse years ago, humiliated and broken. They had no idea. I felt my lips curve again, calm and certain. Let him enjoy his laugh for now. Let Lila smile like she had won. Tonight I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't explain. I wouldn't even raise my voice. I would let them watch. Because this was only the beginning, and they didn't even know what was coming. I turned toward the bartender again, lifting my empty glass ever so slightly. He nodded and poured me another without a word. As I accepted it, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall behind the bar. I didn't see the woman Daniel left. I saw someone stronger, sharper, someone who had waited for this very moment. I glanced at Daniel one last time across the room, my gaze steady and unshaken. He smirked again, but there was something different in it now, just the smallest crack in his confidence. I raised my glass in his direction in a silent toast, my smile deepening just enough for him to notice. Soon, I thought. Soon he would understand exactly what kind of mistake he made the day he underestimated me. And when that moment came, no one in this room would ever forget it. I still remember the sound of my heels on the courthouse steps the day I walked out alone. It was 2019, cold and gray in Chicago, and the sky felt like it was pressing down on me. Just 5 years earlier, everything had been so different. In 2014, when I married Daniel, I believed I was the luckiest woman alive. He was charming in a way that made everyone around him lean closer, convinced he was the man who would never let me fall. We had a beautiful wedding in front of our friends and family. I wore a white lace dress my mother Susan had cried over when she first saw me in it. Daniel kissed my forehead during our vows and whispered that he would never stop choosing me. For a while, I believed him. In 2017, Sophie and Lucas came into our lives. 2 tiny miracles who made every sleepless night worth it. I put my career on hold to be there for them. I traded courtrooms and legal briefs for bedtime stories and bottles. I was tired, sometimes overwhelmed, but I was happy. At least I thought I was. Daniel worked long hours at Brooks Realty in New York, but he always came home late with gifts for the kids and reassurances that the grind was all for us. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. Until the night I picked up his phone. He had left it charging on the kitchen counter while he showered. It lit up with a message. Just one. From Lila Moore. Dinner was perfect. I miss you already. My chest tightened. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe it was harmless. But my hand moved on its own, and I opened the thread. Dozens of messages, weeks of them, photos, promises, words I had once heard him say only to me. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. Daniel stood in our living room with his tie loosened and his face completely calm. You were never enough for me, Hannah. Not for the life I want. I remember how quiet the house was in that moment, except for the hum of the refrigerator and my own heart pounding in my ears. I asked him if he was serious. He looked right at me, his voice flat, and said yes. By the time I filed for divorce, my parents already knew. My father George sat at the head of the table during Sunday dinner and didn't even look at me when he spoke. Hannah, you need to be realistic. You are 30 years old with 2 children. What are you going to do now? I swallowed hard and stared at my plate. My mother reached across the table, her hand brushing mine, but she didn't argue with him. No one did. I was alone, and for a while I believed they were right. The months that followed were brutal. Daniel dragged out every court date he could, not because he wanted me, but because he wanted me to suffer. Every time I sat across from him in that courtroom, I saw the smirk he wore when his lawyer questioned my ability to provide for our children. The day the judge signed the divorce decree, I held my head high, even though inside I was breaking. Sophie was 3. Lucas was 3. They clung to my legs in the hallway of the courthouse while Daniel walked past us without a word. That night I sat in the apartment I had rented with what little savings I had left. The walls were bare, the furniture secondhand, but it was mine. Sophie slept curled against Lucas on the small couch, their cheeks pink with exhaustion, their little hands tangled together. I sat on the floor beside them, my back against the wall, and promised myself through silent tears that I would never let Daniel or anyone else see me as weak again. I went back to work at a small law firm in Chicago. It was nothing like the career I had once imagined, but it was a start. I left the apartment at dawn, dropped the twins at daycare, and came home late every night after putting in hours I didn't have the energy for. Some nights I fell asleep still dressed for work, briefs scattered around me like a paper shield against the world. But I kept going. I remembered the way Daniel looked at me the last time we were in court. That quiet superiority in his eyes. I thought of my father's words at the dinner table, and each time it lit something in me. Anger, maybe, or something stronger. I began to win cases. Small ones at first. A custody dispute for a single mother, not so different from me. A landlord case where I stood beside an old man who had nowhere else to turn. One by one, I built a reputation. I stayed late. I read everything I worked until my hands cramped from typing. And slowly I started to feel it again. Pride. The day I moved into a slightly bigger apartment with 2 bedrooms, Sophie and Lucas ran from room to room, squealing with excitement as if I had bought them a castle. I stood in the doorway and laughed until my throat hurt. I had done that. I had given that to them. I knew I wasn't finished, not even close. Daniel still thought he had won. He thought I was just surviving. But every step I took was leading me somewhere. Every long night, every sacrifice, every time I looked at my children and refused to quit, was building to something I couldn't even name yet. One evening, I tucked Sophie and Lucas into bed, kissed their foreheads, and lingered in the doorway watching them sleep. I whispered a promise I hadn't made out loud since the day I left the courthouse. One day, I will show all of them. Daniel, my father, everyone who doubted me. That day was coming. And for the first time in a long time, I actually believed it. I woke up before the sun most mornings. Chicago was quiet at that hour, the streets still dark and empty, except for the distant hum of the early trains. I would slip out of bed, careful not to wake Sophie and Lucas, and start the coffee machine in my tiny kitchen. That smell became my anchor, a reminder that each day was another chance to climb out of the hole I had been thrown into. After the divorce, I found a small apartment on the north side of the city. It was nothing special, but it was ours. 2 bedrooms, peeling paint in the hallway, and creaky floors that echoed with every step. But it was the first place where I felt like I could breathe. I hung a few of the twins' drawings on the wall, because I could not afford framed art yet, but I didn't care. It felt like home. Each morning I dressed Sophie and Lucas, tied their shoelaces, and walked them to the elementary school a few blocks away. Sophie would skip along the sidewalk while Lucas clung to my hand, still a little shy in the bustling crowd of kids. After kissing their cheeks and promising to pick them up later, I would head straight to the office. Rachel Adams, my best friend from college, was already there most days. She was everything I once hoped to be, sharp, successful, and unshakable. She had built her reputation as one of the top divorce attorneys in Chicago, and she never let me forget that I could do the same. One morning, after I rushed into the office with my coat barely buttoned, she looked up from a stack of files and smirked. "Hannah, you need to breathe. You are going to burn yourself out before you even get started." I tossed my bag onto my desk and grinned back at her. "I do not have the luxury of slowing down, Rachel. You know that." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her eyes warm but firm. "You will get there. You always do." I believed her because Rachel never lied to me, even when the truth was ugly. Those early months were brutal. I worked longer hours than anyone else in that office. I took every case they would give me, no matter how small. Unpaid consultations, messy custody battles, clients who came in crying and left with nothing but hope. I handled all of it. Sometimes I felt like I was drowning in paperwork and deadlines, but every victory, even the small ones, made me feel alive again. Then came the first case that truly mattered. A single mother named Claire walked into the office, her hands trembling as she clutched a stack of documents. Her husband had abandoned her, leaving her with 2 kids and no financial support. I saw myself in her. I saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear I had felt the day Daniel walked out. I threw myself into that case. Late nights at the office, coffee cups stacked on my desk, Rachel sitting beside me, pointing out legal precedents I had forgotten. When we finally walked out of the courtroom with a ruling in Claire's favor, I felt something shift inside me. That night I went home, stood in front of my bathroom mirror, and looked at my reflection. My hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under my eyes, but I didn't care. I saw strength there. I saw a woman who was no longer broken. Sophie peeked into the bathroom and held up one of her drawings. "Mommy, I made this for you." I knelt down and took it from her. It was a picture of the three of us holding hands, smiling in front of our little apartment. My throat tightened. I hugged her close and whispered, "Thank you, baby." Lucas appeared behind her, rubbing his eyes. "Mommy, can I sleep in your bed tonight?" I nodded and pulled both of them into my arms. We curled up together on my bed, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something new. Rachel called me the next day. "You won that case because you refused to quit Hannah. That is the same reason you will win at everything else." Her words stayed with me. I started holding my head higher in court, speaking with more authority. Judges noticed. Clients started asking for me by name. I was no longer just the woman who had been left behind. I was Hannah Brooks, the attorney who fought until there was nothing left to fight with. One evening, after putting Sophie and Lucas to bed, I stood in their doorway watching them sleep. Lucas's little hand rested on his sister's arm, and Sophie's hair was fanned out across her pillow. They were my world, my reason for every long night and every exhausting day. I whispered so softly that only I could hear it. "No one will ever look down on us again." I turned off the light and closed their door. My heart steady, my resolve unshakable. For the first time, I knew this wasn't just about proving something to Daniel or to my father. This was about proving it to myself. And I was just getting started. The letter came on a cold Tuesday morning. I opened my mailbox, and there it was, an official notice from the Cook County Court. Daniel had filed a petition for joint custody. My hands tightened around the envelope as I stood in the hallway of my apartment building. For a moment, all the noise of the city faded. I could see Sophie's backpack hanging by the door, Lucas's sneakers left on the floor, and I felt a surge of anger so sharp it made my chest ache. That night, after putting the kids to bed, I called Rachel. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm and steady as always. "He is really going through with this," I said, pacing my living room. Rachel sighed. "Of course he is. Daniel has never liked losing. But this time we are not going to give him even an inch." The next day, we met at her office. Rachel spread the custody petition across her desk, red pen in hand. "He is trying to paint himself as father of the year," she said dryly, flipping through page after page. "He even attached pictures of himself at Sophie's school recital." I laughed bitterly. He left halfway through that recital to take a call from Lila. "Exactly why we need evidence, Hannah. Not words. Proof." That was when she called Monica Hale, a private investigator with a reputation for being relentless. 2 days later, Monica walked into Rachel's office in a gray suit, her expression sharp and focused. "I will get you what you need," she said simply, sliding a notepad across the table. "But I need access to his schedule, and I need to know everything." I told her about Daniel's frequent trips, the nights he canceled visits with the kids, the weekends. Sophie cried because he didn't show up. Monica listened without interrupting, her pen scratching quickly against the paper. When I finished, she looked at me and nodded. "Give me a week." True to her word, Monica delivered. She sent us photos of Daniel boarding flights to Miami with Lila instead of picking up the kids for his scheduled visitation. She got time-stamped hotel receipts, restaurant bookings, even social media posts where he tagged himself at luxury resorts while claiming to be working late. When Rachel flipped through the folder, she grinned. "This is airtight." The day of the hearing, I wore a navy suit and stood outside the courthouse with my hands clenched so tightly around my bag that my knuckles turned white. Rachel placed a hand on my shoulder. "You have done everything right, Hannah. Let the truth do the rest." Inside the courtroom, Daniel was already seated with his attorney. He looked polished, calm, the very picture of a devoted father. He even smiled at me like this was just another negotiation he expected to win. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Daniel's attorney went first, speaking about stability and family values, painting Daniel as a loving father who only wanted to be present for his children. I almost laughed. Rachel stood when it was our turn. "Your Honor," she began, "my client has no desire to deprive Mr. Brooks of his relationship with his children. But she believes, and we intend to prove, that primary custody is in their best interest." Then she handed the judge Monica's file. Photo after photo, timestamp after timestamp, evidence of broken promises and empty weekends. Daniel's smile faltered. The judge's expression hardened as he flipped through the pages. "Mr. Brooks, can you explain why you were in Miami during your scheduled visitation?" Daniel shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. "Business trip," he muttered. Rachel stepped forward smoothly. "And this business trip required you to dine at a five-star restaurant with Ms. Lila Moore." Daniel's lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. Overruled. For the first time in years, I saw Daniel lose control. His face turned red, his words clipped. He mumbled excuses about meetings and work obligations, but it was too late. The damage was done. When the judge delivered his ruling, I held my breath. Primary custody will remain with Ms. Brooks. Mr. Brooks will have visitation rights every other weekend contingent on his compliance with the court's schedule. I exhaled, my hands trembling as I gripped the table. Beside me, Rachel smiled, her voice low enough for only me to hear. "You just won, Hannah." I turned my head slightly and saw Daniel glaring at me, his jaw tight with fury. For once, I didn't look away. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to understand that the woman sitting across from him wasn't the same person he walked out on. When the hearing ended, I walked out of that courthouse with my head high. Monica was waiting in the hallway, arms crossed, and a satisfied smirk on her face. "Told you I would get it done," she said. I hugged her without thinking, surprising both of us. "Thank you." Later that evening, I stood in my apartment, watching Sophie and Lucas eat dinner at the small kitchen table. Lucas was telling Sophie a story about school, his hands waving in excitement, while Sophie laughed so hard she nearly spilled her milk. I leaned against the doorway, my heart swelling with a mix of exhaustion and pride. For the first time, I felt like I was no longer simply surviving. I had won something that mattered. And if I could win this, I could win so much more. Daniel's glare in that courtroom was still fresh in my mind. It wasn't just anger, it was fear. He had underestimated me once. He would not make that mistake again. The call came on a rainy morning in March of 2021, while I was reviewing a custody case file in my office. Rachel leaned against my doorframe holding a cup of coffee and a stack of papers with a small smirk on her face. "You are not going to believe this one," she said. "Donovan Tech wants to hire you." I looked up from my desk, almost certain I misheard her. Donovan Tech. The billion-dollar tech company in Silicon Valley? Rachel nodded. "They are facing a major intellectual property lawsuit and they want the best. That is you, Hannah." I stared at her for a long moment, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Excitement. I had spent so much of my life fighting to survive, fighting Daniel, fighting to rebuild my reputation. Now someone was calling me, not because of pity or desperation, but because I was good. Within a week, I was on a plane to California. The world outside my window shifted from the cold gray skyline of Chicago to the glittering sun of Silicon Valley. I checked into a modest hotel near Palo Alto, smoothed out my suit, and headed to Donovan Tech's headquarters the next morning. The building was sleek and modern, all glass walls and polished concrete. Inside, I was led through bustling hallways filled with brilliant minds and endless energy. I was introduced to their legal team, and then finally to him, Ethan Reed. He walked into the conference room without the arrogance I expected from a man whose face had been on the cover of Forbes. He was tall, his posture relaxed, dressed in a simple navy suit that looked effortlessly sharp. His presence was quiet but commanding, and when he shook my hand, his grip was steady, warm, and disarmingly genuine. "Ms. Brooks," he said with a small smile, "I have heard excellent things about you." I met his eyes, clear and steady, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift in me. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. I am here to make sure you win this case. Please call me Ethan." From that moment on, he treated me as an equal. We spent hours poring over documents, dissecting every clause, every precedent. He asked questions not because he doubted me, but because he valued what I had to say. When I explained my strategy for dismantling the opposing counsel's arguments, he leaned forward and listened like it mattered. One evening, after a long day of preparation, he stood beside me in the quiet of the conference room. "You are good at this," he said, his voice even and sincere. "You have a way of making complicated things simple." I felt a strange warmth in my chest, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself in a long time. I smiled, a real one, not the polite kind I reserved for courtrooms. "Thank you, Ethan." The trial itself was brutal. The opposing side was aggressive, throwing every possible challenge our way, but Ethan never wavered. And neither did I. We worked side by side late into the night, fueled by coffee and determination. There were moments when I caught him looking at me, his expression thoughtful, and I would quickly look away before he noticed the way it unsettled me. When the verdict finally came down in our favor, the room erupted in relief. I turned to Ethan, and for a moment we simply stared at each other. There was pride in his eyes, but something else too. Something I could not name. Outside the courthouse, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Ethan walked beside me. The legal team was celebrating, but he lingered near me, his voice lower than before. "Hannah, I was wondering if—" I raised an eyebrow. "If what? If I could take you to dinner? Not as your client, just as me." I froze for half a second. It had been years since anyone had asked me that. Years since I allowed myself to even think about the possibility. My heart raced, but instead of panic, I felt an unfamiliar steadiness. I looked up at him, studying his face. He wasn't pushing, he wasn't demanding. He was simply asking. "I would like that," I said softly. The smile that broke across his face was small but certain. "Great. No rush. Whenever you are ready." That night back in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed staring out at the California skyline. I could still hear his voice in my head. I could still feel the calm certainty in it. For the first time in a long time, it didn't scare me. It didn't feel like losing control. It felt like a door I thought was locked had quietly opened. And I realized I wanted to see what was on the other side. Our first dinner together was simple. Ethan chose a quiet restaurant in Palo Alto. Nothing extravagant, just a place where we could talk without interruption. He held the door for me and smiled in that calm, steady way of his that seemed to ground me without even trying. We talked about everything except the case we had just won. He asked about Sophie and Lucas, and I told him how Sophie loved to draw and Lucas could spend hours building Lego cities on the living room floor. He listened. Not the distracted kind of listening people give out of politeness, but the kind that makes you feel seen. By the time dessert came, I realized I had laughed more in that one evening than I had in years. When he walked me to my car, there was no rush, no expectation. He just said he hoped we could do it again. And for the first time in a long while, I wanted to say yes without hesitation. Weeks passed, and our dinners turned into weekend walks, coffee dates, and long conversations that stretched late into the night. It was slow, steady, and safe. When I finally introduced Ethan to Sophie and Lucas, I watched him kneel down to their level and ask them about their favorite superheroes like it was the most important thing in the world. Lucas grinned and launched into a story about building a Batmobile out of blocks, while Sophie shyly offered him a drawing she had made. He thanked her like it was priceless, and in that moment, I felt something I had almost forgotten: hope. One evening, Sophie had a school play. I was running late from a meeting, worried I would miss her part, but when I arrived at the auditorium, I saw Ethan already there. He stood at the back of the room, his hands in his pockets, watching Sophie with a soft smile. He had no reason to be there, other than wanting to be. When Sophie spotted him, her face lit up. After the play ended, she ran straight past me and into his arms. "Uncle Ethan, did you see me?" He laughed and hugged her. "I saw everything, and you were amazing." I stood there for a second frozen, before my chest warmed in a way that nearly brought tears to my eyes. Lucas joined in, tugging at Ethan's sleeve and demanding he come see the drawings he had made for him at home. Later that night, after I tucked the kids into bed, I found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. He looked up at me, his smile soft. "You have two incredible kids, Hannah." I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a small smile tugging at my lips. "They like you." He chuckled. "I like them too." It was quiet after that, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that felt easy, comfortable, the kind I had never had with Daniel, even in our best years. Not everyone was as quick to trust him as my children. My father George cornered me during Sunday dinner the next week. He eyed me across the table with that same skeptical look he had worn since my divorce. "Are you sure about him, Hannah? Men like that? They are not usually the kind who stick around." I set my fork down and met his gaze. "Dad, Ethan is not Daniel." He grunted, unconvinced, but my mother touched his arm gently, and for once he didn't push it. Ethan kept showing up. He came to Lucas's soccer game on a cold Saturday morning, standing on the sidelines, with his hands shoved into his coat pockets, cheering louder than anyone else. When Lucas scored his first goal, Ethan lifted him into the air, like he had just won a championship. He stayed for dinner that night. While I cooked, he helped Sophie with her math homework patient in a way that made me pause in the doorway and watch him without saying a word. When the kids finally went to bed, I walked into the kitchen and found him rinsing the dishes. "You do not have to do that," I said. He smiled over his shoulder. "I wanted to." I stepped closer, and for the first time I didn't feel like I had to keep a part of myself guarded. I realized how rare that was, how precious it felt to trust someone without constantly bracing for disappointment. After he left that night, I stood at the window of my apartment, watching his car disappear down the street. My father's voice lingered in my head, his doubt sharp and familiar, but I pushed it aside. I thought about Sophie's laughter when Ethan clapped for her at the play, about Lucas holding his hand without hesitation, and about the way Ethan looked at me, like I wasn't broken, like I never had been. I knew then that this wasn't just another fleeting moment of happiness. It was the beginning of something real, something I hadn't dared hope for. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was fighting alone. The email from Monica arrived late on a Thursday night, while I was sitting at my kitchen table sipping tea and helping Sophie cut out paper stars for her school project. Lucas was already asleep on the couch, clutching his favorite blanket. My phone buzzed, and when I saw Monica's name, I felt that familiar spark of anticipation. I opened the attachment, and there it was. A detailed report that made my pulse quicken. Daniel Brooks, the man who had spent years trying to humiliate me, had been quietly funneling more than $20 million into offshore accounts. He was using shell companies and fake contracts, hiding behind layers of financial deception that looked almost impressive in their arrogance. I stared at the numbers for a long moment, the weight of it sinking in. I forwarded the report to Rachel with a single line. "You need to see this." 5 minutes later, my phone rang. Rachel's voice came sharp and clear through the line. "Hannah, this is it. This is how we end him." I leaned back in my chair, my gaze shifting to Sophie, who was holding up her crooked paper star and smiling proudly. My chest tightened with a mix of anger and determination. He had fought me for custody. He had mocked me in court. He thought he was untouchable. Not anymore. The next morning, I met Rachel at her office. Monica was already there, her expression calm and professional, as she slid a stack of documents across the table. Bank transfers, property records, and emails between Daniel and his financial advisor. Everything meticulously organized, every piece connected. "This is enough to bury him," Monica said. "But if we push this too soon, he will find a way to wriggle out. We have to be patient." Rachel tapped her pen against the table. "We prepare everything, we lock it down, and then we hit him when he least expects it." I nodded, my fingers curling around the edge of the folder. Let him feel safe. Let him believe he has already won. For weeks I lived in silence, carrying the knowledge of his secret like a weapon I wasn't ready to draw. Daniel still sent smug messages about visitation schedules, always trying to assert control. I played along, never revealing a single hint of what was coming. Ethan noticed the tension in my shoulders one evening when he came by for dinner. After the kids had gone to bed, he poured me a glass of wine and studied me with that steady gaze of his. "Hannah, what is going on?" I hesitated for a moment, then told him everything. About Monica's findings, about Rachel's plan, about Daniel's offshore accounts. Ethan didn't interrupt. He didn't tell me to calm down or second-guess what I was doing. He simply reached across the table and rested his hand on mine. "I will help you however I can." The simplicity of it almost undid me. After years of fighting alone, I didn't know what to do with someone who just stood beside me without question. The plan unfolded quietly. Rachel drafted the preliminary complaint for the IRS, carefully outlining every piece of evidence. Monica double-checked every document, every timestamp, every transaction. Ethan connected me with a financial consultant. He trusted someone who specialized in dismantling schemes like Daniel's. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. I attended parent-teacher conferences, took the kids to the park, and smiled through small talk with Daniel during custody exchanges. He strutted around like he had already erased me from his world. One Saturday afternoon, he showed up late to pick up Sophie and Lucas, his tie loosened, his cologne heavy. Lila sat in the passenger seat of his car, her sunglasses perched on her head, smirking like she owned the street. "You look tired, Hannah," he said with a mocking smile. "Are you sure you can handle all this on your own?" I forced a polite smile, tucking Sophie's hair behind her ear as she climbed into the car. "Just fine, Daniel. You worry about yourself." He laughed, and I let him drive away, believing every word. When I returned upstairs, I found Monica waiting at my dining table, her laptop open, spreadsheets glowing on the screen. She didn't look up when she spoke. "He is arrogant. That will make him sloppy." I sat down across from her. "Then let's make sure he pays for it." By the time winter crept into Chicago, everything was in place. Rachel filed the paperwork discreetly. Monica's report was airtight. Ethan reviewed every detail, his quiet confidence steadying me in a way I had come to rely on. One night, after the kids were asleep, I stood at the window of my apartment and looked out at the city lights. I could almost see the future laid out before me. Daniel still thought he was untouchable, but soon his world would come apart piece by piece. And when it did, I would be there to watch. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, tucked between bills and junk mail. I knew the moment I saw the embossed gold lettering on the front. It was an invitation to Daniel's 40th birthday party. Manhattan. Black tie. The kind of event he lived for, surrounded by people who worshipped his success. I held the invitation in my hands for a long moment before setting it on the kitchen counter. Sophie and Lucas were coloring at the table, their quiet chatter filling the room. But my mind was already spinning. That evening, I drove to Rachel's office. She looked up from her desk as I placed the invitation in front of her. "Are you going?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. I smiled, slow and certain. "Of course I am." Rachel leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "You realize he will expect you to show up alone, right?" "Good. I want him to." The door opened behind us and Ethan stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of me before resting a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Whatever you are planning, I am in," he said simply. Rachel glanced between us, her mouth curving into the faintest smirk. "Well, if we are doing this, we are doing it right." Over the next week, every detail fell into place. Rachel finalized the report for the IRS, meticulously documenting every offshore account and every forged contract Monica had uncovered. I watched her slide the thick file into a sealed envelope. "This is going to hit him like a freight train," Rachel said, her voice almost satisfied. I nodded. "Let him think I am still the woman he left. Let him laugh one last time." Meanwhile, Monica kept feeding us information. One afternoon, she called to update me, her voice edged with amusement. "Lila is pushing him. She is tired of waiting for a ring, and from what I hear, she has started threatening to spill everything if he does not make it official." I almost laughed. The man who had once been so careful was now drowning in his own arrogance. Good, I told her. Let her keep pressing. It will make him careless. The night before I mailed the report to the IRS, Ethan came over. The kids were already asleep, their drawings scattered across the coffee table. He stood in my kitchen sleeves, rolled up his hands, resting casually on the counter as he watched me seal the envelope. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. I met his gaze. More than I have ever been. He stepped closer, brushing his fingers over mine before taking the envelope and holding it for a moment. "Then let's finish this." The next morning I walked into the post office and handed the envelope over the counter. My hands were steady. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. When I walked back out into the cold Chicago air, I felt lighter than I had in years. Over the next few days, I went about my routine as if nothing had changed. I got Sophie ready for her art showcase. I helped Lucas with his spelling homework. I met Ethan for coffee after work, and we laughed like people who hadn't been scarred by the past. But underneath it all, I carried the quiet knowledge that Daniel's empire was already beginning to crack. One night, while sitting at Rachel's office, we reviewed the final timeline. "The IRS will move fast once they see this," Rachel said. "He will not see it coming." I leaned back in my chair. "And I will be standing in the same room when it hits him." Rachel's eyes gleamed. "Then I guess we better make sure you look the part." On the day of the party, Ethan came to pick me up. He stood in the doorway of my apartment, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression calm but sharp, as if even he understood the gravity of this night. "You look incredible," he said, as his gaze swept over the deep emerald gown I had chosen. I smiled faintly. "I am not going there to blend in." He offered me his arm, and I took it. The weight of the past falling away with every step we took toward what was coming. That night in Manhattan would be Daniel's stage, but I was about to rewrite the script. The car pulled up in front of the Grand Sterling Hotel in Manhattan, its towering glass facade glowing against the night sky. I stepped out, the cool air brushing against my skin, and for a brief second I stood there looking at the grand entrance. Music spilled faintly from the ballroom above, mingling with the hum of expensive cars arriving one after another. Ethan squeezed my hand once before letting go. "Go make your entrance," he said softly. I glanced at him and smiled. He would come in later at exactly the right moment. For now I had a role to play, and it required me to walk through those doors alone. Inside the ballroom was everything I expected. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like frozen stars. Polished marble floors reflected the light, and the air was thick with perfume and ambition. Daniel loved this world. The kind of world where appearances meant everything, and the right smile could buy silence. I could feel eyes turning toward me the moment I entered. My navy gown fit like it had been made for this night, the deep color catching the light with every step. I walked slowly, unhurried, letting the sound of my heels echo through the grand room. A hush fell over a few conversations, and I knew they were watching. And then I saw him. Daniel Brooks stood near the center of the room, a glass of champagne in one hand, Lila Moore draped on his arm like she was his prize. He was older than the man I married, sharper around the edges, but the arrogance was exactly the same. When his eyes found mine, his smirk widened. "Hannah," he said loudly enough for several people around him to hear, "still the same I see." Lila tilted her head, her smile sharp and cruel, as she looked me up and down. She whispered something into Daniel's ear that made him laugh, a short, condescending sound that reached me even across the room. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked past the crowd, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, and brought it to my lips with a calm, steady hand. Every movement deliberate, every gesture measured. Around me, whispers started, some curious, some pitying. I caught fragments of them. She came alone. I thought she moved back to Chicago. She looks different, stronger. Daniel raised his glass toward me in mock salute, his grin infuriatingly smug. He thought this was his moment. He thought I had walked into his world to be humiliated one last time. I smiled. a small, quiet smile that held no fear. He didn't know it, but he was already standing on the edge of a cliff, and I was the one who had led him there. Rachel's words rang in my mind. Be patient. Let him play his part. I mingled exchanging polite greetings with people I barely remembered, nodding at old acquaintances who looked surprised to see me here. My heart was steady, my focus sharp. I could feel Daniel's gaze following me across the room like he was waiting for me to falter, waiting for the woman he used to know to crumble. Instead, I turned and met his stare, holding it for just a fraction longer than necessary, before I sipped my champagne. That tiny gesture was enough to make his smirk falter for the briefest second. Lila tugged on his arm, whispering again. He nodded absently, but didn't look away from me. I moved to the balcony, taking a breath of the cool night air. The city stretched endlessly below, glittering and alive. Behind me, the music swelled, the laughter rising and falling like waves. This was Daniel's stage, yes, but I was no longer the supporting act. I stood there for a moment, savoring the quiet, until I heard the sound of footsteps. Rachel appeared at my side, her sharp eyes scanning the room before she joined me. He looks nervous, she murmured. Good. She glanced at me with a hint of a grin. You ready for the next part? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I turned back toward the ballroom. Daniel was laughing too loudly now, holding Lila closer like a man desperate to remind the room that he was still untouchable. But I saw it. A crack in the performance. I placed my glass on the railing, squared my shoulders, and walked back inside. My heels clicked against the marble, each step echoing like a countdown only I could hear. The night was far from over, and Daniel Brooks had no idea his perfect little world was about to shatter. Daniel's laughter carried across the ballroom like a sharp edge. He stood in the center of the crowd, a glass of champagne raised high, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He spoke of his latest real estate deal, bragging about numbers he thought would impress, soaking in the attention of every person who circled him. Lila clung to his arm, her smile polished but tight, as if she knew something was about to go wrong but couldn't quite place it. I moved closer, my heels steady against the marble floor. I didn't rush. I wanted him to see me coming. Each step was deliberate, a reminder that I was no longer the woman who used to shrink under his shadow. When I reached the edge of the crowd, I stopped. Daniel's eyes found mine, and he smirked, clearly convinced that I had walked right into his moment of triumph. He tipped his glass slightly, his voice dripping with mockery. Hannah, I almost didn't see you there. Brave of you to show up tonight. I smiled calm and sharp. Brave has nothing to do with it, Daniel. A few heads turned, whispers passing like quick sparks through the crowd. I didn't look away from him. Daniel chuckled, amused. Still the same I see. Always trying to prove a point you can't win. I let his words hang in the air, then took a single step forward. Pity, I said softly, not loud enough for the whole room, but just enough for him to hear. Not everyone agrees with you. And then, as if on cue, the double doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Ethan stepped inside. He wore a black tailored suit, simple but perfect, the kind of elegance that didn't need to be announced. Conversations faltered, heads turned. It was not just his presence, it was the quiet authority that followed him into the room like a second skin. He didn't rush, he didn't need to. Daniel's smirk froze. Ethan's gaze swept the room once before finding me. He walked toward me with absolute certainty, his steps unhurried, his expression calm and unshakable. The sound of his shoes against the floor seemed louder than the murmurs rising around us. When he reached me, he stopped just close enough for the room to hold its breath. Then, without hesitation, he reached for my hand. Happy birthday, my love. His voice was low but steady, and it carried enough for the nearest tables to hear. Gasps followed like ripples in water. I felt Daniel's eyes on us, his shock so visible it was almost satisfying. Ethan brought my hand to his lips, kissed it once, then turned toward Daniel. There was no hostility in his face, no smugness, only the kind of quiet composure that cut deeper than anger ever could. Daniel blinked his glass, lowering slightly. Lila's grip on his arm faltered. She looked at Ethan, then at me. Her perfectly composed smile trembling at the edges. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I let the silence stretch, let every guest in the room take in exactly what they were seeing. Daniel Brooks, the man who had once left me broken, was standing frozen in front of an audience that had just witnessed the shift in power. Ethan slid his arm around my waist with effortless familiarity, and I leaned into him. Not because I needed the support, but because I wanted Daniel to see it. Congratulations on 40. Daniel, I said lightly, my voice smooth. Quite the celebration? For a long, unbearable second, Daniel didn't answer. His knuckles tightened around his glass. He forced a laugh that sounded thin and hollow. Well, I suppose I should say the same to you, Hannah. Looks like you found someone willing to tolerate you. Ethan's hand tightened slightly at my waist, but I didn't flinch. I smiled soft and unshaken. Tolerate me? No, Daniel. He married me. The room shifted again, sharp and electric. Someone near the back gasped audibly. Lila's finger slipped from Daniel's arm, and for the first time all night, he looked unsteady. Ethan extended his free hand toward Daniel. We haven't met formally. Ethan Reed. Daniel didn't take it. His jaw worked silently, his face pale beneath the ballroom lights. Ethan didn't press. He simply turned back to me, kissed my temple, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. You look incredible tonight. I smiled and met his eyes. Thank you. Around us, conversations started again, this time louder, sharper. People whispered Daniel's name, followed by mine, followed by Ethan's. I could see the judgment in their faces, the way their attention shifted from him to us. Daniel had wanted a stage tonight, and I had given him one. But I had also taken it for myself, and he knew it. As I stood there in the center of the room with Ethan at my side, watching Daniel's perfect facade start to crack, I felt the first taste of what I had been waiting for. This was only the beginning. The ballroom doors opened with a heavy, deliberate sound that silenced the room. Two men in dark suits entered their badges, catching the light as they moved with quiet authority. Behind them, an officer in a gray jacket carried a folder so thick it seemed to hold the weight of an entire case. The music stopped. Conversations died. All that remained was the echo of their footsteps across the marble floor. Daniel turned, confusion flashing across his face. The lead agent spoke clearly, his voice steady enough to cut through the tension. Daniel Brooks, we need you to come with us and cooperate with our ongoing investigation. For one long second, nobody moved. Then the room erupted in whispers. I stood perfectly still, my hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm, and I watched Daniel's smirk falter into something brittle and uncertain. He laughed, a sharp, defensive sound that rang hollow in the vast room. This is ridiculous. There must be some mistake. The agent didn't even blink. We have a warrant. We can discuss this downtown. Daniel's gaze darted around the room, searching for someone to come to his aid. Lila stood beside him, her posture stiff, her manicured fingers clenching his sleeve. Then, as the agent stepped closer, she let go. Her face hardened, and without a word she turned and walked away. The sound of her heels striking the marble floor echoed like a betrayal Daniel never saw coming. I saw him watch her leave, the disbelief in his eyes almost pitiful. When he finally turned back, his gaze found me. This is you, isn't it? His voice was low, sharp, but I didn't flinch. I held his stare calm and steady. No, Daniel. This is you. The agents flanked him now, their hands firm on his shoulders. He tried to shrug them off, puffing up his chest, clinging to the arrogance that had defined him for so long. But no one in that room believed him anymore. The crowd that once laughed at his jokes and envied his success now stared in silence, their expressions shifting from fascination to quiet judgment. My father moved through the onlookers and stopped beside me. For years he had questioned every decision I made. Tonight he put his hand on my shoulder and gave it a steady squeeze. Hannah, he said, his voice low but certain. I was wrong about you. I didn't take my eyes off Daniel, but I reached up and covered my father's hand with mine for just a moment. That small gesture said everything I couldn't bring myself to speak aloud. Ethan's hand closed around mine, grounding me. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. Daniel's voice cracked as the agents took his arms. You think this will end me? You think this changes anything? One of the agents read him his rights, his words calm and absolute. Daniel's protests grew smaller, swallowed up by the quiet power of inevitability. The ballroom parted as they led him through every step, a slow unraveling of the man he used to be. Phones were raised, guests whispered. The empire Daniel had built on lies was collapsing in front of an audience that would never forget it. When he passed me, he slowed for just a heartbeat. His eyes were full of fury, but beneath it, I saw something else. Fear. I didn't say a word. I simply watched him go. The doors closed behind him, the sound sharp and final. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. Then my father stepped closer, his voice softer this time. Hannah, I am proud of you. I turned to him, my throat tight and knotted. Ethan's fingers laced with mine, warm and steady. I looked at him, and for the first time, I allowed myself a quiet, satisfied smile. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was calm, inevitable, and tonight it belonged to me. And Daniel Brooks had nothing left. A month after that night in Manhattan, the world was quieter. The headlines had faded from the front pages, but the consequences had not. Daniel Brooks was under federal investigation, his assets frozen, and his name carried more weight in court filings than in business magazines. Lila had vanished from his life, and the people who once crowded around him at every party now crossed the street to avoid being seen with him. I stood in my kitchen one morning, sunlight spilling through the window, while Sophie and Lucas bickered over who got the last pancake. Their laughter filled the room warm and unburdened. I flipped the pancake onto Lucas's plate and ruffled his hair. For years I had lived under the weight of what Daniel had done to me, but now it was gone. Ethan leaned against the doorway holding 2 mugs of coffee, one for me and one for himself. He watched the kids with a quiet smile before meeting my eyes. "You look lighter," he said. I smiled back. "I feel lighter." The days that followed were not glamorous, but they were mine. I walked Sophie and Lucas to school, greeted the other parents with a confidence I hadn't felt in years, and went to work knowing I had built my career back from nothing. Rachel still called me almost every day, her sharp voice full of that familiar mix of pride and teasing. One afternoon she said, "You do realize you're officially unstoppable now, right?" I laughed. "I am just getting started." But it wasn't just about my work anymore. It was about the quiet moments that no one else saw. Movie nights with the kids on our worn-out couch. Ethan stopping by with takeout because he knew I had been working late. Evenings when we sat on the balcony, the city lights spread out below us, and he would tell me about his day while I leaned against him, feeling for once like I didn't have to carry everything alone. One weekend, Ethan suggested something unexpected. "Let's get out of the city," he said, his eyes warm and steady. "Just you, me, and the kids. Somewhere quiet." We drove up to Lake Geneva. Sophie spent the entire weekend collecting rocks by the water, while Lucas tried to skip them across the surface. I watched Ethan teach him how his hands guiding Lucas's smaller ones until the rock finally bounced once, then twice. The look on Lucas's face made me laugh so hard I almost cried. That night after the kids were asleep in the cabin, I sat with Ethan on the porch. The air was crisp, and the stars felt close enough to touch. He wrapped an arm around me and rested his chin lightly against my hair. "You know," he said softly, "you never have to fight alone again." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting his words settle into me. For so long, I had been defined by battles, by survival. Now, for the first time, I believed him. When we returned to Chicago, my father came over for Sunday dinner. He had been quieter since the night of the party, more thoughtful, as if something in him had shifted. After dinner, while Ethan washed dishes and the kids chased each other through the apartment, my father pulled me aside. "I was wrong, Hannah," he said. "About you. About everything." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. This man who had always measured love in lectures and expectations, and for the first time I saw something different in his eyes. "I know, Dad," I said softly. He nodded once, then pulled me into an awkward, almost clumsy hug. But it was real. By the time spring came, Daniel was a ghost in my life. His name was now only attached to legal documents and news articles that no longer hurt to read. I didn't need revenge anymore, because I had already won. One evening, Ethan and I stood on the balcony watching Sophie and Lucas chase each other in the courtyard below. He slipped his hand into mine. "You did it, Hannah," he said. "No," I corrected him, my voice quiet but certain. "We did it." He kissed my temple, and in that moment, I realized that what I had now wasn't just a victory. It was a life, a good one. And for the first time in years, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. A month later, the world felt different. The papers were full of Daniel's downfall. His assets had been frozen, his reputation destroyed, and his so-called friends had vanished. Lila had disappeared from the social scene entirely, leaving no trace but whispers of her betrayal. For years I had dreamed of this day, and now that it had come, I didn't feel anger or triumph. I felt free. Life moved forward in the quietest and most beautiful way. Sophie and Lucas laughed more these days, their shoulders no longer heavy with the tension they could never name but always felt. My father came by every Sunday helping Ethan fix things around the apartment, while my mother cooked enough food to feed an army. Even Rachel, who prided herself on being hard to impress, finally said one night, as we shared a glass of wine, "You know, Hannah, I always knew you'd win." Then one afternoon, Ethan knelt in our living room, while Sophie and Lucas cheered from the couch. He didn't make a speech. He didn't need to. He simply held up a simple, elegant ring and looked at me like I was the only person in the world. "Hannah, will you marry me?" I didn't cry, but I wanted to. I just nodded and whispered, "Yes." And when he slid the ring on my finger, Sophie squealed so loudly the neighbors probably heard. Lucas grinned from ear to ear and announced he wanted to be the ring bearer. 2 weeks later, we were standing on a quiet beach in California. The sky was painted in soft pinks and golds as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The waves rolled in gently, almost as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. Ethan looked devastatingly handsome in a simple suit, and I wore a white dress that flowed around my feet like it had been made for this moment. Sophie and Lucas held hands. Sophie clutching her bouquet of tiny wildflowers, Lucas grinning proudly in his little navy suit. My father stood in the front row, his hands clasped tight, his eyes glistening with pride. When the officiant asked if Ethan would take me as his wife, he looked at me and said yes, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. And when it was my turn, my voice didn't shake. I said yes because I wasn't afraid anymore. When we kissed, Sophie clapped so hard she nearly dropped her flowers, and Lucas shouted that it was the best wedding ever. Everyone laughed, and for the first time in a very long time, my laughter was effortless. As the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, Ethan pulled me into his arms, his breath warm against my ear. "You were never a failure, Hannah. Not once." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words settle into every scar Daniel had ever left behind. And for the first time, those scars didn't ache. They felt like proof that I had survived. Later that evening, we danced barefoot on the sand, while Sophie and Lucas chased each other near the water's edge. My parents watched from a distance, my father's arm around my mother's shoulders. Rachel stood beside them, raising her glass toward me with a knowing smile. I looked at Ethan, at my children, at the family I had fought for, and I felt it deep in my bones. This was my victory. Not because Daniel had lost, but because I had finally won everything that mattered. I turned my head slightly, meeting the gaze of the small camera Ethan's friend had been holding to record our vows. I smiled steady and certain. If anyone has ever called you a failure, prove them wrong. Not with anger, not with revenge, just by living well enough that they have no choice but to watch you rise. And as the waves kissed the shore and the night wrapped itself around us, I knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of the sweetest chapter of my life.